Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with two guests. Dr. Moshe Hoffman, a repeat guest on the show. He is now a research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology. And also Dr. Erez Yoeli, a research scientist at MIT's Sloan School of Management, where he directs the Applied Cooperation team. And we're going to focus today on their new book, Hidden Games, The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior. And by the way, thank you a lot for the hard copy.
Entirely our pleasure. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, sure. No, it was really a great book. Let's start with this then. What aspects of human behavior is game theory best suited to explain? Because I would imagine that perhaps we would have to add certain other approaches to get a better grasp of certain aspects of human behavior. But in this case, where does game theory apply the best?
Yeah, we agree that it's just kind of like one toolkit and one approach, and to really understand human behavior, you kind of need a lot of different tools. So game theory tends to be the most useful and insightful when you're dealing with settings where what's optimal for any given person to do depends on what others are doing. So in these kind of like social interactive settings, it's not always obvious what would be the best behavior, what would be functional or optimal. And, game theory is kind of a toolkit that's been developed and designed to help us understand what that is and how it works. And maybe just to add to that, oftentimes game theory is applied in settings where people are consciously strategizing about how to behave optimally. And one of the key things that we're doing in this book is kind of applying game theory to like a slightly different setting, but one that also has this kind of social interactive component. Namely, when we're dealing with social settings where morality and politics and passions and principles and all these other things come in, where we're not necessarily consciously trying to strategize about what's optimal, but where our tastes and our preferences and our beliefs might have evolved or learned and in these social settings in a way that might also be responsive to game-theoretic logic. And so game theory, we think, applies to any setting where what's optimal depends on what others are doing, including these settings where we're not consciously behaving strategically, but where our non-conscious, moral intuitions and other intuitions have been shaped in these social settings.
Mm-hmm. So in previous interviews with you, Dr. Hoffman, I think we've already touched a little bit on this, but why do we tend to be so oblivious to the motivations and incentives behind our behavior?
Yeah. Maybe just to preface a little bit, Erez might jump in to help me with some of these questions. I think the way that we've planned it, just to be clear why you keep asking me, is I was going to take like most of the first intro questions, and then when we get to like some of the specific game theory models, Erez will take the lead. But hopefully Erez will still jump in every now and again to help out. I'm sorry, do you mind just repeating the question?
Yeah, why do we tend to be oblivious to our own motivations and incentives?
Yeah. So I guess the story is that oftentimes, like, learning and evolutionary processes are shaping not our conscious choices, but are shaping things like our tastes and our beliefs and our ideologies. And when it's shaping those things, we're not necessarily at all consciously aware of the underlying incentive structure or the underlying motives. Those things are just kind of responding through subconscious processes to these things. And in fact, all we are doing consciously is thinking about like how to behave optimally given those tastes and beliefs. And we're totally not at all thinking through where those tastes and beliefs are coming from. Oftentimes, that's not even relevant to us. So like, to best predict your friend's behavior or to think about your own behavior, it often helps to just understand their tastes and what they believe. And, you know, we're very, very good at thinking through that, like what's called theory of mind in psychology. We're very, very good at kind of reverse engineering and trying to figure out what's driving other people. You know, there's a huge psychological literature on how we do this. And it's kind of a fundamental part of what human beings do. We try to understand ourselves and others by thinking about their tastes and beliefs. But that psychology isn't necessarily built to understand where those tastes and beliefs are coming from. And that process of shaping our tastes and beliefs is often well outside our conscious awareness and not something that really matters for everyday decision making and judgments. But obviously, as good scientists, we still want to know where that comes from.
Yeah. So in the book you talk about learning, and more specifically you say that learning shapes beliefs and tastes rather than just shaping the desired behaviors directly. But why is that the case?
Yeah. So I guess that's a thought-provoking question, and we should maybe think about it a little bit more. I guess our first guess is to a response. Erez and I were just talking about this before the call. Our first guess, what we think is probably the best explanation, corresponds with what people in the learning literature refer to as model-free or model-based learning. And so, and in general, like unless you have a lot of information, it's better to learn in what's known as a model-free kind of way. And that we think kind of corresponds to this notion of our tastes and our beliefs and our intuitions being what adjusts, as opposed to just our behaviors. So we think it might help to give a concrete example of that. So in the book, we talk about, you know, our taste for spices and how those probably developed because spices, as in, you know, spicy cuisines, probably developed because spices help kill bacteria, foodborne pathogens, and particularly in hot, arid climates, particularly on meats, you're really worried about such pathogens, particularly before refrigeration. And so having like various combinations of spices tends to help keep the meats good. And, you know, the cultures that develop these kind of spicy cuisines, like there's kind of two ways they could have developed this. One way is they could have, or people within these cultures could have had a sophisticated model of chemistry and biology to understand kind of how pathogens work and how spices and particular combinations of spices will combat pathogens. And they could have developed this kind of rich scientific model of these things. And then optimize given that model. So they could say, well, given this particular bacteria that's like, you know, in this particular type of meat, we should use this particular combo of spices. But now that we have refrigeration, we don't need that. You know, they could have like really thought this through and really like calculated the exact optimal behavior. But that requires a very sophisticated model. One that, you know, most people throughout most of human history, at least in this domain, the domain of like spices and bacteria, didn't have. And if they would have like tried to build a model, they would have failed miserably. Like they just didn't have the right tools for it. And so a model-based learning system, namely building up a sophisticated model of how the world works, and then optimizing your behavior given that model, like you kind of really need the right tools and knowledge to do that. And in this case, like we just didn't have that. And so it's not really a good way to do things. Instead, what you could do is learn in a model-free way, one that doesn't require that much sophistication about how all this stuff works, but just uses very, very simple kind of coarse tools, like, for instance, trying out different foods and not eating them again if you get sick, and maybe even, like, developing a taste against those foods. Or, like, looking at what other people eat and, like, learning to like the things that you see other people eating, especially if they don't get sick or seem to know what they're doing. And so this kind of learning process where your taste for foods adjusts based on your experience or other people's experience without a model of how the world works, that's kind of a model-free way of doing things. It's a little bit coarser, but it requires a lot less information. It requires a lot less sophisticated model of how spices and bacteria works. And so particularly in this domain where like we don't have that rich model, or at least we didn't until modern scientific tools, it would make a lot more sense to kind of learn via having tastes and intuitions adjusting, instead of just having a behavior adjusting with the sophisticated model. So hopefully that answers your question, and hopefully that's clear.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was just wondering here, because when it comes to that specific example of using spices in food, I mean, there are some people that are more biologically minded, let's say, that they just try to explain where that behavior comes from, originally by people from certain areas in the globe being exposed to higher parasite stress loads in this case, I guess. But I mean, that would only explain the origins of it, not why and how it spreads, right?
Yeah. So, and maybe Erez can jump in on this because he's done a lot more background research on culinary history.
Okay.
But maybe I'll say before he jumps in to correct me that I kind of think that there's maybe two important factors that are going on, and again maybe he'll jump in to correct. One is there are lag and spillover effects, like is often the case with learning processes, particularly these kind of model-free learning processes that involve adjusting intuitions and beliefs and tastes. In those kind of processes, you tend to have, because the process is kind of coarse, it's not going to be like so fine-tuned to the individual circumstances. It doesn't adjust perfectly as you change those circumstances. So for instance, if you're born and raised in one culture and then you migrate to another one, or your culture kind of develops a cuisine and then gets refrigeration afterwards, the exact taste of that culture will lag a little bit. It'll take some time for, Indian cuisine to adjust to the fact that now they have refrigeration. Or for an Indian person who moves to America to adjust to the fact that, in America, it's not quite the same climate where you don't have the same pathogen load as in India. And maybe even, when they're raising their kids, they'll still raise them using these same kind of learning processes to develop an appreciation for the cuisine of the motherland that they emigrated from. So the lag could be a few generations. So that's one reason why the cuisines can be somewhat sticky. And stickiness and lags are something you see a lot of. Nathan Nunn, just to name drop a little bit, he's done a lot of nice research on kind of cultural lag effects and showing that this happens a lot. That oftentimes things start off functionally and they have an important function originally, but the effect could last many generations after that function is removed. Maybe one other thing to mention when we're talking about cuisines is of course there's many other reasons why cuisines evolve and spread aside from this spice story. That's just one story. So other things, for instance, are you might want to show off the fact that you have access to these markets or that you're wealthy enough to afford them. And for spices in particular, that used to be a very, very important factor. It's it used to be the case that it's less true now, but and Erez will know the dates better, but I don't know, Catherine de Medici's time. I think still then, having spicy foods, it was very hard to get these spices. They were very expensive, and if you wanted to show off that you were really powerful monarch or well-resourced royalty, then you would have very rich spicy cuisines as one way to show that off.
Yeah, we have evidence from the Middle Ages, from cookbooks written at the time by chefs and courts. That suggests that the average cuisine that they were cooking in a banquet or something like that would be pretty spicy. And there's even a little bit of evidence. We don't have a ton of evidence on it because the evidence just doesn't survive. But there's a little bit of evidence that when these cookbooks would then be adapted for more home cooks, or at least merchants who are wealthy, that they also were trying to emulate this. So there would be this attempt to show that you knew what was being eaten in the court, which was a way of demonstrating your closeness to the court, and that was done through food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe just before you move on, I want to highlight maybe one more thing about this example. Again, there are many factors that will shape local cuisines and different people within that population, depending on their class and stuff, what kinds of foods they like. But what's important about these examples is there are many kind of hidden functions at play, and B, people aren't necessarily aware of or consciously thinking about those functions. They might just develop a taste, and that's kind of a common theme throughout our book. That we'll try to use game theory in some cases. In the case of spices, you don't necessarily need game theory, but to try to figure out what the hidden function is. Even when people aren't aware of it, even when it's built into their taste. And cuisine is, I guess, a good case study for that.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to take this opportunity, because you've been using a lot the word functional and function and stuff like that, to insert this question here now. I mean, because the subtitle of your book includes explaining irrational human behavior, and I mean, I would like to understand what is rationality from the perspective of game theory, and how it's related to functionality. Because I mean, there are several different definitions of rationality, and sometimes, I don't know, just to be a little bit simplistic here, sometimes atheists might say that the behavior and beliefs of religious people are irrational, but probably from the perspective of a social scientist, they are mostly functional. So I mean, do you understand what I'm trying to, where I'm trying to arrive here? I mean, give us perhaps a definition of rationality and how it relates to functionality.
Erez, you want to go? Or you want me to take this?
If I were to answer this question, I would avoid it by saying I don't want to give a definition, and I would just give some of the common definitions people might give. Okay. So one person might give a definition that says that the thoughts that are going through your mind, they need to be based on accurate beliefs. You need to be making decisions based on those beliefs in ways that make sense, that are accord with something like Bayes' rule, that you are pretty good at statistics when doing that, and so on and so forth. That might be one definition of rationality. That you have good information in the first place, that you seek out that information in ways that make sense, et cetera, et cetera. Another definition might be that you behave in ways that one can uncover, that maybe you're not aware of why you're behaving in that way at all, or maybe whatever model you have for why you behave is totally off, but there is some hidden logic that we can uncover that has a rhyme and reason to it. And that's the sense I think that you were referring to when it comes to religious people. We know that religions have rhymes and reasons to them. There's really nice research. The book Big Gods comes to mind as like a nice place to look at an overview. But there's more than this also. There's Sosis's work, etc. Those rhymes and reasons are things we can uncover, but that most people who are participating in religion aren't aware of. Would you call that irrational or not? It's up to you, depending on how you want to use the word. As long as we kind of understand what you mean by it, then it's fair play. I think for a lot of people, they think of that as irrational, but I think it has a rhyme and reason, and I think that we can talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to take a small step back, because in my previous question, at a certain point, you were talking about spillovers. So tell us a little bit more about what spillovers are and what kinds of behavior can we get a better grasp on by studying them.
You want this one or me?
You can get it if you feel ready.
Sure. In general, a spillover is just a behavior that develops for one reason in one context and then is being applied in another context where maybe it doesn't apply. The reason for its development doesn't really apply anymore. If to continue with the example of spices, suppose you developed a liking for spices, say because you came from India where there isn't great refrigeration and it's pretty hot and the meat distribution system isn't so great, and so there's plenty of good reasons to use lots of spice. Then you move to the United States where there's pretty good refrigeration. It's New York or Boston, and it's pretty cold. And so the risk of foodborne illness is actually pretty low. The food distribution system here is very sophisticated, and there's good testing and so on and so forth that helps to prevent foodborne illness. And yet you continue to like spicy food. And when you go to a place that doesn't spicy food, you're like, this is pretty bland. That's a spillover. Yeah, I think that's the answer. What kinds of behaviors would we try to understand using that? I think there's a lot of cases where people get confused because you tell them, oh, let's look for a functional explanation for this. And then the function doesn't apply in the particular setting that they are looking at. A very common place where this happens is if they're looking at laboratory experiments. Laboratory experiments, to some extent, are designed to elicit spillovers. You're taking somebody into this very artificial environment. They've never been in a purely anonymous setting in some sort of like room with no windows in the university. And it's double blind, which is something that never happens in real life. And then you're like, okay, and now we're going to ask you to do some stuff. You're going to get $10 and you're going to, maybe give that $10 to some other guy who you'll never meet, who will never know who you are, etc. The whole point of that is to tap into the psychology that developed outside of that room. And if the laboratory experiment is failing to do that, it's not going to be a useful experiment. And so in some sense, it's designed to elicit a spillover. But people kind of forget that, and they're like, oh, look, people gave in this experiment. And so if you think that the behavior is being driven by, say, reputation concerns, or, you're trying to use a Nash equilibrium analysis, and it doesn't fit the behavior of the Nash equilibrium analysis because the likelihood of a repeated interaction isn't there in that particular setting, well, that's not the right way to interpret the situation. The whole point is to think about, well, yeah, this is not what that psychology was designed for. Let's use our models to model that, the settings that the psychology was designed for, and then it's true that we can get them to spill over into the lab.
Yeah, so you mentioned Nash equilibrium there, so we will get to that because I want to go through some basic concepts in game theory here, just for people to get a better grasp of what you present in the book, and then the kinds of models and examples we will go through. So tell us now about primary and secondary rewards.
Oh, you're on this one, or am I?
You can go.
This is me? All right, imagine for primary and secondary rewards, where I go to first is like a dog trainer. A dog trainer is trying to train a dog to sit, to react to its leash in particular ways. It's trying to elicit certain desired behaviors. It's trying to calm the dog down. Maybe the dog was abused and get it used to human touch again, things like that. The dog trainer always starts this with food. Food is something that animals evolved to like, including us, and that's a liking that's fairly universal. The dog trainer can kind of count on the animal liking food and reacting to it in positive ways, and then what the dog trainer will do is associate these other behaviors with the food, which gets the animal to eventually maybe start to like them in and of themselves. So maybe the animal previously didn't like being touched, but if you give it a cookie enough times as you touch it, and kind of condition the animal to realize that touching comes with food, eventually the animal starts to like touching also. And eventually might even start to like touching in and of itself. The dog trainer will always make sure that every once in a while, at least, it still associates the touching with the food, the petting with the food, and so that association doesn't break. But it can also be the case that eventually the animal will like the touching enough that you could touch the animal and the animal will like it. The food is what we would call a primary reward. The touching is what we might call a secondary reward. It's a little complicated in this particular case because some animals, some kind of touching is probably a primary reward. They just evolved to like it in and of it themselves. So it's not the cleanest example. But the fact that there are certain things that get associated with a primary reward, say like a dog bowl or a leash. Dogs did not evolve to know what a dog bowl is and like it. They didn't evolve to know what a leash is and like it, but they associate it with primary rewards, with going outside, with going on walks, with getting food. And so they start to like them in and of themselves. When they see them, they get excited. It's a similar story. Again, we're animals too. We're ones with perhaps more sophisticated cognition in certain ways, more social cognition in certain ways, but we're the same. And so we have certain primary rewards that guide what we kind of all start liking, and those primary rewards also can guide us to start liking other things, and those other things would be called secondary rewards. And those can be things like, remember in The Wire, there was the detective who really liked making doll furniture, and that was this like meditative practice for him that he liked to do. Nobody evolved to like that, but they did evolve to learn to like things like that. And so for him, making doll furniture is a secondary reward. He likes it in and of itself, but he learned to like it because presumably he got some sort of primary rewards that were associated with it.
Erez, can I just push you to kind of articulate a little bit why we're harping on this distinction?
Yeah, I think in the book we're interested in the question of like what is the origins of certain tastes and beliefs, and to what extent can we use game theory to elucidate that. And a lot of tastes are secondary rewards. And so we're just used to thinking about them as something we like. we don't distinguish between primary and secondary rewards. We don't have a model for that in day-to-day life. But when it comes time to understanding where those tastes and beliefs come from, it's pretty good to keep in mind that a lot of them are not necessarily, even though we think of them as fixed and we just kind of like that and do it, and do things associated with it and that lead to it. It doesn't mean that we should think of them as fixed. We should think of them as being able to come from someplace. And so keeping straight the secondary and the primary rewards, and what kinds of things can we explain where they come from, and what kinds of things should we hold constant, that's important in our analyses.
So just to give a concrete example that comes up, we talk a lot about altruism, and trying to explain altruism, and kind of classic examples of how altruism gets explained in like the behavioral literature. One classic example is this idea of warm glow. Like, why do we give inefficiently? Why do we give in these weird ways? Like we'll give before asked, but we'll go out of our way to avoid being asked. Like the classic example, the classic explanation for this is we get a feeling of warm glow when we give, and that feeling of warm glow is insensitive to like efficacy, and is only shown when you're asked. So
and there's even neuro studies that will show that the brain lights up in the same way as when you do other pleasurable activities, when you do nice things, right?
And so warm glow is kind of like the belly rubs that Erez was talking about for dolphins or whatever animal training he was referencing, and it's or like building of these doll houses by that character in The Wire. I forget what was
his name, the detective.
Everybody likes him. He's an older black dude, police investigator. Anyhow, we all have hobbies. Like we have hobbies, and like we develop things that we like. But like warm glow fits into that same category. It's not like we evolved to feel warm glow in like these very, very particular ways, and it's completely immune to like what gets reinforced by society or what tends to lead to like reputational consequences and stuff like that. It's like, no, warm glow itself kind of needs to be explained and comes from somewhere. And game theory can help us understand, especially when you have this like evolutionary and learning lens on game theory, it can help us understand why warm glow happens to have the features it does, and when it shows up, and how people learn it and how people can unlearn it and things like that.
Yeah, well, maybe since we're getting into popular culture now, maybe if we have time later in the interview, we might get to explain Will Smith's behavior at the Oscars. I don't know, let's see if we'll get there. Anyway, what about proximate and ultimate levels of analysis? I mean, and why particularly is it important to make this distinction here?
It's a similar distinction to the one we were just talking about. In the book, we have a chapter on these sort of three key distinctions that we want the reader to be aware of. And we put it up front because it's part of this process of flipping your perspective or having sort of an out-of-body perspective. We're used to going around the world and experiencing it in certain ways, and we want you to stop and question, where did that psychology even come from in the first place? And we think that these three distinctions are helpful for doing that. So primary and secondary rewards is the first one. The next one is this idea of proximate versus ultimate explanations. This one refers to this idea that if you ask somebody why they are doing something, they'll have an answer often. And for warm glow, for instance, the example that Mo was just giving about doing good behavior, they might say it feels good or it's the right thing to do. That would be a proximate answer. Proximate because it's the thing they have close to them, they have at hand. But we are going to ask the question, where did that intuition come from? Where did that warm glow feeling come from? Which is the thing that Mo was just referring to. The thing that may be perhaps confusing here is that like a proximate answer or an answer that is dependent on secondary rewards, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. This can, there can be some overlap here. But the important thing is to keep straight that what we want is an answer that provides, that is focused on primary rewards. We want an answer that is not at a proximate level, but rather is asking at an ultimate level, where is that coming from?
Mm-hmm. And so the third distinction is emic-etic. Could you explain that?
Yes. No, me again? Mm-hmm. Emic-etic is coming from anthropology. It's a distinction that is drawn between answers that are given by somebody who's steeped in a culture versus somebody who is outside that culture and trying to understand where something came from in the first place. To give a concrete example, think about the kippah. Jews wear a kippah, and if you Google this and ask why do Jews wear a kippah, you will find answers by Jews that might go something like, it's there to remind us that we are special, or there to remind us that God is always above us. In fact, I've Googled this, and you'll find Lubavitcher websites that will give some sort of story like this. There's also some story about how it originated in the Bible, and that, you know, it's really far-fetched, and I don't remember the details, but it's there. You can find stuff like this. If an anthropologist were to listen to these kinds of stories, they would be like, well, you know, maybe the anthropologist is an atheist, and the anthropologist says, well, I don't think it's really there to remind them about God. I don't even believe in God. So they might say, let me look at the details of this story and see if I can piece together some other explanation. And they might find something like, oh, look, the first time Jews really wore head coverings was in, you know, I found like one place in the 900s in Baghdad, and then later we see it again pop up in the 1100s in northern Italy or something like that. You know, and they'd be like, I mean, in each of the cases, it was mandated by the local rulers in order to distinguish Jews from Christians. And then it seems like the Jews start doing this voluntarily in the 1350. You know, like this is the kind of story that they would develop. They would start looking into the history. And then they might say, look, the Jews really only start to do this at first in places where they're really trying to distinguish themselves from others. So first, somebody else forced them to distinguish themselves. And then they decide that they want, for whatever reason, to distinguish themselves from others. And that seems to me like maybe it's an explanation for why they're wearing head coverings. It's to distinguish themselves from other groups. And maybe it has some, you know, signaling of your own internal belief system and how strong it is value as well, and so maybe that's adding to it and so on. So they would give that kind of answer. That's an etic explanation. It's from outside the culture, as opposed to remind me of God, which is an emic explanation, which is from inside the culture.
By the way, since we're talking about this, in order to study and understand human behavior, to what extent do the explanations people come up with matter?
I feel like this is a tough question, because there are cases where the justifications people give seem to kind of pin them down into certain kinds of behavior going forward, and they can't just change them. And then there are cases where they seem to be able to just like, it doesn't really matter at all what justification they give. And I don't know, I have a clear sense in my mind. Mo has spent a fair amount of time thinking about this, and so I'm going to hand it over to him and see if he can add more to this.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a first order approximation, we're going to ignore emic explanations and focus on etic, and that's where we'll apply the game theory. But you're right that like emic is often important and worth understanding, and has some clues as to what's going on, and can sometimes actually like shape people's beliefs and behavior and incentives in its own right. And I think that it probably requires a lot more investigation on our part and other researchers' part, but B, a longer conversation to kind of better understand how that process works. But maybe just to give one example or insight on the topic. But again, just to be very clear, this is kind of second order. Like we really think most of our work is focused on etic, and only in some cases do we think the emic is actually binding people, like Erez said. So maybe two concrete examples where it binds people and the underlying logic. So one concrete example is the founding fathers needed to justify overthrowing founding fathers. That's what we say in America, I guess. For non-American audience, maybe it's not self-explanatory.
The rebels.
Huh? Yeah, those are the people. Those were the wealthy elites who wrote the history books and set up the government and originally declared independence from the British and led the rebellion against them. Okay, so like George Washington, Ben Franklin, these kind of people. Okay, and we have all sorts of emic stories that we tell ourselves in America about how great these people were and how like good their principles were and so on and so on. And they did have some principles that we're quite fond of, like this idea of like liberty and freedom and equality. But of course they were also stealing land from natives and enslaving black people and doing that far worse than the British were doing. And that was in fact one of the main complaints was the British didn't give them the freedom to steal land from the natives and we're starting to treat them as bad as black people, which they thought was like totally against their liberty. So that was like one of the complaints was like we're not black, why are you enslaving us? Like okay, so the notion of so they had these emic arguments, and as like historians we can look at them and be like, okay, yeah, those are things they said, but like if you look at their behavior, they had flaws. And really they also had like some self-serving motives, like they were trying to like maintain power and wealth and things like that, and the British were interfering with that. So self-serving motives, but like these highfalutin justifications, like liberty, equality, and Locke and things like that. Okay, so as a first-order approximation, it doesn't seem like those highfalutin principles really constrain them. Like they did have slaves. They benefited a lot from rebelling. They ended up maintaining a lot of wealth and power from doing that. But okay, it seemed to still play some constraining role. So for instance, after the revolution, they felt somewhat compelled to reduce the slave trade. There were a lot of arguments, during the war about like, wait, how could you be making this case about like liberty and equality, but yet you own slaves? And like a lot of British propaganda was focused on that, and they felt a little bit guilty and hypocritical. And there's some evidence that led them. For instance, many of the founding fathers ended up, freeing their slaves, at least in their death. Okay, so they clearly felt guilty and they felt some sense of hypocrisy. Maybe not as much as we would have liked them to feel. So it wasn't like fully binding, but it still had some effect on their behavior. And then 100 years later during the Civil War, and later during, the suffragettes movement, and later during the civil rights movement, these arguments came back to bite them. So notions of equality and liberty that they used to justify rebelling against the British ended up somewhat constraining them, constraining our Constitution and our activists, or helping the activists make their case later on, that like, look, you're inconsistent, you clearly weren't driven by those principles, you clearly don't believe in the Constitution unless you also give women the right to vote, or unless you also, let black people have equal rights. And so these kind of consistency arguments end up having some bite. It's somewhat second order in the sense that like, okay, it takes 150 years. Okay, like even now they don't have, full equality, and like we haven't quite lived up to our principles. But like it still does have an effect on history. Okay, so that's one example where like the emic arguments have some impact because of these kind of consistency motives. But that impact is, it's only somewhat constraining. It's, if that was the real driver of our behavior, it wouldn't take 150 years, and it wouldn't be only on the margin. Okay, it would. Okay, so just one more example that I think is quite illustrative is like why think about abortion in the U.S. I guess this is true in many countries. There's religious people, especially people on the right, especially tend to be very against abortion, and you can ask why that is. And like from an etic perspective, probably our guess is in general, religions and tight-knit cultures try to constrain sexual behavior, particularly the behavior of women. You want to make it harder to have sex outside of the socially sanctioned, monogamous marital bond. Okay, and in general, female sexual behavior gets heavily controlled in many ways, like the way they dress. You can get like extreme sanctioning or even killed if you have sex with the wrong people or at the wrong time, like very, very heavy sanctions. Okay, one way that you can control women's behavior is you make it so that it's very hard for them to use birth control or abortion. The more that they can have access to birth control and abortion, the easier it is for them to have sex outside of the marital bonds. Okay, so why would there be such a strong movement against abortion? Okay, it's just one way to control female sexuality. Okay, but that's not the emic argument. If you ask any religious person why they're against abortion, they'll say something like, or at least the religious people in the U.S., they'll say something like, well, because the fetus has a soul and sanctity of life, and abortion is murder. Okay, so that's we don't think that's the real thing that's driving the behavior, because that's kind of an arbitrary way to define life. Like it doesn't look like they believe that life is more sacred than people on the left. But okay, so that's a justification given. But like with the founding fathers and their principles of equality and liberty, there's some constraining effect that this has, we think. So what would be an example of a constraining effect? Well, think about women who, in the case of, who want to have an abortion in the case of rape. That's an instance where, the original etic argument we gave, which is, prohibiting abortion helps, disincentivize sex outside of marriage. Well, you don't need to disincentivize women from being raped. They already, very much don't want to be raped. And so, you're not adding a deterrence effect in that case. And so by prohibiting abortion in the case of rape, you're not helping deter this kind of extramarital copulation, but all you're doing by making it prohibited to have abortion in the case of rape is making these people's lives much harder, and maybe even somewhat incentivizing rape, which is something that even religious people, there's no etic explanation for why they would want to do that. And so the only reason we think for why you still might be against abortion in the case of rape is because, well, once you've given this argument about like life being sacred and coming at the moment of conception, it's kind of hard to make the rape exception case. Like, yes, it sucks for the woman, but like that life is sacred. You need to protect life. What can you do? And so you're kind of bound in that case. And as is often the case when the emic arguments end up binding you, these are kind of fringe cases that are uncommon. Most abortions aren't in the case of rape. Many people will find an excuse or an exception in that case. So even religious people will say it's acceptable in that case. So it's only somewhat binding, and it's only binding because these cases are so rare. If those became the predominant case of abortion, maybe the underlying motives at play would actually come back into play, and this would bind them less, and they'd change their stance. I guess that's our story about. That's one story about the role that emic might play. Second order, somewhat binding because of things like consistency, but only in fringe cases, only when the costs aren't that big.
Mm-hmm. So tell us now about Nash equilibriums. Or equilibria, sorry. What is that about?
You want me to keep talking?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so I guess anybody who's seen any game theory has heard of Nash. So we'll just give like the rough idea, but it is the cornerstone of game theory. And so as we mentioned before, game theory is kind of like a useful toolkit for understanding what is optimal when your own payoffs depend not just on what you do, but also on what other people do. So you kind of like interact with settings. And in those kind of cases, oftentimes it's quite counterintuitive what would be optimal. So for instance, if we're thinking about, a classic application of game theory, like auctions, like how much do you want to bid on an auction when other people are bidding against you and they might value the item slightly different from you. You don't know exactly how much they value it. Okay, so, what's optimal there, it's somewhat like hard to know without, this toolkit. Okay, but the toolkit actually makes it quite simple. Roger Myerson won this Nobel Prize for this revenue equivalence theorem. It says like, in all these classes of auctions, here's like the optimal way to behave. And it turns out in like first price auctions, which is like an auction where the person wins the item if they give the highest bid and they pay what they bid. And if we assume that like our values are independent of each other and so on, add a few assumptions like that. Turns out the optimal way to bid is to kind of shade your value. So if I value this art object by $100, then I take into account the number of people bidding against me. It's 4, and I divide my value 100 by, I forget if it's 3 or like some function of the number of bidders. Okay, and it's a linear function. It's very it's very simple. It turns out if everybody's using that same function, it's optimal for you to do that as well. Okay. That's the basic idea of Nash. It says take a strategic setting like first price auctions with independent values, and it'll tell you what's some strategy that everybody could use such that nobody could benefit from deviating. Bid 3 over n times your value. I don't know, whatever that formula is. Okay, and that's an Nash equilibrium, and that turns out to be like the cornerstone of solving. Thinking about how we can behave optimally in strategic settings like this. And so, maybe one thing to add is why Nash is such a valuable concept. It's really easy to kind of check in any given situation what's something that everybody could do such that nobody could benefit from deviating. And in every chapter of the book, for instance, as you would do in every game theory class, we specify what the Nash equilibrium is, and then we like walk through, okay, what's the possible deviations? Can you benefit from this? And it's a routine process that gets you a lot of the intuition and gets you a lot of the insight that game theory has to offer, this checking for deviations. Okay? And maybe one more thing that makes Nash quite powerful is, In auctions, like, it gets justified by saying, okay, well, if anybody could benefit by deviating to a different bidding strategy, well, they'll hire some kind of consultant or have a boardroom full of people figuring out how to bid that would have figured out a better way to bid than that. Okay, and so if anybody's bidding in these auctions, if they have enough money on the line, they have enough time to prepare, they're going to figure out this kind of like optimal formula. Okay, but that's not the only way to justify Nash. And in our setting, we're going to justify it differently using like evolution and learning, like we discussed. And evolution and learning conveniently also only give you Nash equilibrium. And it's pretty kind of easy to see that, which is Nash by definition is a specification of how everybody would behave, such that nobody could benefit by deviating. Well, suppose that somebody could benefit by deviating. Well, it's very easy to see that any evolution or learning process would through mutation or random experimentation, that person would find that new way to behave, they'd do better, and they in evolution they'd have more offspring, or in learning processes they'd get imitated more, or they'd start doing it more frequently. So any kind of normal evolution and learning process will get you out of, will find these deviations, and so they'll kind of only settle on things that end up being Nash, and that's why where Nash is relevant not just to conscious optimization processes like auction, but also many processes that where agents are learning or evolving and not consciously thinking through their strategies.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about a specific example you explore in the book. So how can we apply game theory to understand human cooperation, particularly what sustains it?
So I think if you want to kind of, cooperation is a rich topic, and so you want to start by saying, what is cooperation? Cooperation is a situation where you're asking somebody to do something and that thing costs them, but it benefits others. At the simplest level, you might have two individuals interacting, and one individual can do the other some kind of favor. It takes some effort, it takes some resources in order to do that favor, so there's a cost to the individual doing the favor and a benefit to the other individual. At a broader societal level, though, it can be things where something like not littering, where it's a bit of a pain to carry the candy bar wrapper in your pocket. It might melt on your, and stain your pants. You have to remember. It would be easier to just toss it on the ground, but we don't want public spaces to be full of wrappers, and so there's a benefit to you paying the cost of holding the wrapper and benefiting society in that way. The way that cooperation tends to be, or at least one of the major things that tends to drive cooperation, we don't have to take a stake on this being the only way, but one of them is basically a sense that there's a repeated interaction. There's some benefit in the future that is a social benefit of some kind that will arise if you cooperate now. This, again, can be in interactions between two individuals. It can also be in these larger groups. So if we're talking about, for instance, littering, then what would that threat be? Well, somebody might walk over and be like, hey, pick that up or I'm going to knock you over the head. And so in the case of something like littering, which is sustained via these more distributed norms, what we just call that is third-party punishment. There's a risk of third-party punishment in the event that you don't cooperate. And the key things you need in order to sustain cooperation via norms in this way are you need third-party punishment of some kind, and then if you have punishment itself is costly often, and so you're going to need to give an incentive for that punishment, and that's often done via some kind of higher order punishment, or it depends on the particular sets of norms, but often higher order punishment will play some sort of role. What does higher order punishment mean? It's just the person who needs to actually enforce the norm, there's something causing them to actually threaten, say, to hit somebody over the head. So they'll either get rewarded or punished for doing that.
Mm-hmm. So talking about norms, what are norms from a game theoretical perspective, and how does something like norm enforcement arise and work?
Norms are fundamentally just one way to get, and probably the core way we do, at least some folks like Rob Boyd have argued this is the core way that humans get cooperation of the kind, like don't litter or show up for war or things like that. Fundamentally, they are psychological suite of tools that allow us to sustain these cooperative behaviors. That requires basically that we be able to identify a norm violation. That's a little bit different than what other animals have to do here, because another animal will recognize when you transgressed against them. A norm violation, the candy wrapper that you threw on the street doesn't hurt me. So I have to be able to identify that you've done something wrong in a somewhat more abstract way, that you violated the norm. So a slightly different requirement. And then there's a need to be able to keep track of whether somebody has violated the norm and whether somebody has engaged in third-party and higher-order punishment when they are expected to. So there's kind of this richer reputational our ability to keep track of that reputation is a little bit richer than what might be required if we were just keep doing some sort of tit for tat in a repeated prisoner's dilemma, say, which might be the classic model. So that's, I think, at its most fundamental level, what a norm is. It's an ability to keep track of whether somebody has done the thing that is being asked of them. It's an expectation that somebody behave in a certain way, and it's an expectation that people enforce that via third-party punishment and higher-order punishment. And then you can get lots of, as long as those punishments and rewards are meaningful, you can get lots of also costly behaviors. You can get people not to litter. You can get them to give to charity. You can get them to help you build a canal. You can get them to help with the war effort and turn off their lights if the Germans are flying over, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of thing that norms are able to get us to do at a scale that other animals maybe aren't so capable of doing, because of the fact that our reputational senses are a little richer. Mo, what would you add stuff to that?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, maybe one thing to add is we think other things are going on with altruism too, and a great reference. Nicola Rahimi, maybe I'm mispronouncing her name, sorry, has this nice book that kind of summarizes all sorts of other mechanisms that are relevant for cooperation. And Rob Boyd, as Erez mentioned, has a very nice book that kind of summarizes a lot of what's going on with norms, including how they're unique to humans and how they show up in in other cultures, including small scale societies. A different kind of animalist than that book. Michael Matthew Krishna has a great review paper, I think with Joe, I can't remember.
Yeah, go ahead.
On norm enforcement. So
and
take a look at that.
Yeah.
Say it again?
And cooperation more broadly.
Yeah,
I think
good.
If you look for norm enforcement, you won't find the paper. But if you look for Joe Henrik, Michael Mutha Krishna cooperation, you'll find it.
Mm-hmm. Good. But I guess the thing that we were trying to emphasize in our chapters on this is with norms, we tried to focus on, like you mentioned, the game-theoretic component. And the game-theoretic component, as Erez mentioned, is really these kind of two features. Once you have third-party punishment and higher-order punishment, the fact that you punish people for violating the norms, even if you're not a direct recipient, and you punish people for not punishing when they're expected to. Those two features, which are really well documented, Joe, Michael, Rob will talk about a lot of evidence for that. Once you have those two features in play, that can sustain, as a Nash equilibria, almost an arbitrary set of norms. So quite a lot of things can be sustained this way, as Erez mentioned quite a few. It makes them Nash. And that says that it's a self-sustaining way to incentivize kind of this behavior, with the exception that, and we then talk about this a lot in the subsequent chapters, that if you are sustaining cooperative behavior this way, it has a few odd features. So it makes, for instance, plausible deniability and common knowledge effects really important and come into play. It kind of requires that the norms have to be discrete, so they have to be very, very kind of well defined and categorical. And just by the fact that this is what's sustaining them, third-party punishment and higher-order punishment, that kind of gives you as necessary conditions. Well, you can sustain almost anything, but they have to be discrete, and it's going to be highly sensitive to plausible deniability effects and things like that. And that you really kind of get out of the game theory.
Mm-hmm. And that last part you mentioned is what gets us into the limitations of norms, right?
That's right. So the fact that, what Mo is alluding to is the fact that because norms require this kind of distributed methods of providing rewards and punishments for these costly behaviors and for punishing in as well, there's an element of coordination. We kind of all have to be on the same page. We have to know that when a norm violation happens, everybody kind of has to agree on that. And in order to have that coordination, that's where a lot of these constraints are going to come from. That's the thing that's going to require that norms, it needs to be the case that when a violation happens, it's sufficiently observable so we can all find out about it. It needs to be the case that it's something that's sufficiently well-defined and unambiguous that when it occurs, all the third parties in higher order, potential higher order punishers kind of agree on that. Otherwise, there's no real incentive to punish, and so you won't learn to punish in those cases. Same with the categorical versus continuous distinction that Mo alluded to. Norms really work much better when they're categorical. It's much easier to enforce a norm that's categorical, yes, no. Was there a violation, yes versus no, as opposed to something that's really dependent on fine-grained information. Like, to make this concrete, it's easy to reward somebody for giving to charity. Yes, they gave. No, they didn't. As opposed to giving to a very efficient charity, because efficiency is something that's like, it's continuous. Either you're more efficient or less efficient. It's something that maybe is like we don't necessarily agree on in the first place. Some people have this definition of efficiency. Other people have that definition of efficiency. That's going to make it hard for those third parties to all be on the same page. It's going to make it hard for this distributed distributed reward mechanism to work, and so that is the kind of constraint that we are going to be able to identify with game theory, and it's all coming from that coordination element.
Mm-hmm. But when it comes to categorical norms specifically, where do they come from and how do they spread?
You or me, Mo?
You can get this.
Okay. So let's start by just reiterating what we mean by a categorical norm. A categorical norm is something where the norm depends on something fairly coarse, like a yes-no answer, as opposed to something more fine-grained, like is this a particularly effective charity or not, which is something that can vary. Another example of this might be something like the norm against the use of chemical weapons. It's been in the news again, sadly. That norm is a norm against the use of a category of weapons. Are they chemical weapons versus not? Not a norm against causing undue suffering, which obviously, if we had such a norm, that would have been violated at this point. It's not a norm against some sort of underlying thing that you might think we actually care more about. I mean, the reason we presumably care about chemical weapons is because we don't want people to suffer. We don't want to cause a lot of death. And so we might ideally have the norm be based on that. But it turns out that in this coordinated environment where we're depending on the coordination between different nation states, and they don't all necessarily have the same information, in that kind of environment, something that's blunter and is just dependent on did you use chemical weapons or not, that's something that we can enforce as long as we have sufficiently good information, even if it's not perfect, but sufficiently good information about whether a chemical weapon was used. Because if I got the signal that a chemical weapon was used, I can probably guess that France got it as well, and if they didn't, maybe I can communicate to that in a verifiable way, and so we can coordinate to stop that. We might have liked to have prevented undue suffering, but that's something that we can't necessarily coordinate to do, and so we have this alternative that approximates that to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
So, to bring it back slightly more to Ricardo's initial question, but like I guess the main point is like maybe this is exactly what Erez said, but just to put it in my own words, we might like to have norms that are continuous, but those are, the game theory tells us, unsustainable. But you can have categorical norms, and so the thing that the game theory is teaching us is kind of a restriction on what kind of norms are possible. Now that's not really telling us which norms we'll end up with. It's just kind of telling us which ones we won't. And I guess you still need to have a richer model and maybe a tool other than game theory to say, well, why did we end up with these norms of all the possible norms that are out there? Maybe you need something that talks about cultural group selection. I don't know. Maybe you need to, I don't know. You need some kind of dynamic process. But what the game theory can tell you, and what it tends to be very good at telling you, is what things aren't possible because those things aren't equilibria. And norms that depend on continuous variables, those are not equilibria. The game theory can help us rule those out.
Mm-hmm. So one of the aspects you mentioned when we were talking about norm enforcement was punishment. How is punishment motivated in this case, human societies?
So when I was referring to punishment, I used the phrase higher order punishment.
Yes.
And That's what I meant. So there's got to be some sort of, if punishment is costly, if by walking over to the person who's dropped the wrapper and threatening them, you're risking getting into a fight yourself, then we're going to need to give somebody an incentive to do that. That's again, I mentioned before, it really depends on exactly how the norms are working in a particular way. There has to be some motivation for that. The motivation we often focus on is the one that I referenced regarding higher order punishment, which is also distributed. The folks who are around will say something like, "Hey, I appreciate that you went up to that guy and told him to pick up the wrapper. That was cool." And you can see that humans do engage in that. There may also be some sort of like person at the top of the pyramid who's also giving an incentive to the enforcers. This is what happens in the mafia. There's a capo, and the capo pays enforcers, and the enforcers do the punishing. But the way that they get incentivized isn't through some distributed way. It's through this more hierarchical thing. Both of those can work, and they can help to sustain norms, and the details matter. But at the end of the day, there's also going to be an element of coordination, because the capo is only in power because everybody kind of is coordinated on the fact that he's the boss, and that will ultimately behave that in terms of what that leads to in terms of constraints on norms. That will also lead to some similar constraints on the kinds of norms that a capo will try to enforce.
Mm-hmm. So I have a kind of big, complicated question here, but let's see if we can tackle it. So
this is the first big, complicated question?
No, not the first one, but another one, let's say. So, I guess that we can say that game theory also helps us understand how humans process information. So, I hope you agree with that. If not, please tell me. But with that in mind, does that tell us anything about why the brain processes information this way, or where does this come from? Does the way the human brain process information through a game-theoretic perspective, and perhaps we could say through game-theoretic mechanisms, is it evolved? For example, can we say anything about that?
You want me to take this one?
Yeah, you got this one.
First of all, I guess game theory is kind of a toolkit that helps us as scientists analyze what's the kind of optimal way to respond in a given setting with a given incentive structure and with given types of information, given context. So it tells us what would be optimal in those contexts. And so for human agents to then kind of respond in a way that kind of mirrors the game theoretic analysis, it requires that we're somehow kind of responsive to these incentives in this kind of sophisticated way, that we can kind of take into account the particular situational variables that matter, take into account the type of information and incentives that are going on. So I guess another way to frame your question is like, what causes us to kind of respond to incentives in like that kind of nuanced way, and how nuanced are we when we do that? How tightly are we going to mirror the models?
Yeah.
And, I guess, one possibility is like, for some of these models, we just have very, very built-in, like very hardwired responses to these kinds of situations. So like, I don't know, take cost of signaling, which kind of like says, we have like conspicuous consumption, like we buy Rolexes and these kind of expensive, useless items to show off how wealthy we are. Now, maybe it's possible that there's like an actual, like very, very specifically evolved module that says, if you have a ton of resources, waste them on very scarce things that other people who don't have resources can't get, because that's a good way to show off that you have these resources. And maybe other people will have a module that says, oh, if you notice that this person has access to scarce resources that other people that seem wasteful and only the really resourceful people would be able to afford, well, you should know that those people are attractive and have access to the most wealth and power. And so maybe that's like an evolved module for detecting, for being a conspicuous consumer and being attracted to those who conspicuously consume. And maybe for some game theoretic models, we have built-in modules like that. I think that's possible. And maybe there's a few cases like that. But I think that it's also possible that, and I guess this gets into like this big like question in evolutionary psych and in like, cognitive psychology of like how nuanced does our mind have to be to like be well adapted and to incorporate information. But like the alternative possibility, instead of like a pre-specified kind of very domain specific module, is some kind of like fairly generalized learning process that takes into account that is fairly good at categorizing settings and extracting information from those settings in a way that's kind of very, very efficient. And so, you have models like from Josh Tenenbaum et al., which talk about how we, obviously not consciously, but subconsciously, model the world in a Bayesian way and have like this hierarchy of Bayesian models in our head. Like, first we kind of classify, is this a gain setting? And like, okay, well, what kind of gain setting is it? Well, maybe it's a costly signaling setting. And, we're good at kind of updating our priors on these different things. And then, okay, within a costly signaling setting, is this the kind of setting where it makes sense to like be the conspicuous consumer or to like save your resources? And so, it's possible that we have these kind of like hierarchical models that are really good at categorizing and updating priors at various levels and are kind of less specialized and fine-tuned to the game. It's possible that that's also going on, and I guess that's kind of a richer question in evolutionary psych more broadly of how specialized do the modules have to be. But I think this is just kind of like one example of that. It's like, okay, the game theory models are assuming that people are adapting to the particular incentive and informational structure. How are they doing that, I guess, is the perennial question. But yeah, that's what it's assuming, that we're fairly good at that. To be fair, though, that most of our models don't require that. Like, you don't have to be perfect for the game theory models to have insight. You just kind of need to be somewhat responsive to key features. So, like, Erez talked about norms before. Like, okay, you have to have some way of detecting that you're in a situation where there's, like, third-party punishment and higher-order punishment. You have to be somehow sensitive to the fact that there's a coordination element. And in those settings, you have to kind of realize you could take advantage of plausible deniability, and you should pay attention to categorical distinctions, but not so much to continuous variation. You don't need to exactly solve for the Nash equilibria. Like, you don't need to exactly calculate everything. You just kind of need like those few key features. So it doesn't require that much sophistication for the insights from game theory to come into play.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, going back to the emic-etic distinction, do you think that branches of philosophy, like, for example, moral philosophy and ethics, can be simply emic? I mean, from a game-theoretic perspective, of course, because we could get into more recent things in political psychology, for example, and talk about moral foundations theory, but just strictly from a game-theoretic perspective, what do you think about that?
No comment. This is really a question for Mo, who again has interacted about this more. But the short answer to what he's about to say is we very much think that, yeah.
Okay, so could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
That's on you, Mo.
Oh, no, well, so then I'm going to have to ask you, Carter, to repeat the question.
Okay, the question was if you think like that branches of philosophy, like moral philosophy and ethics, are simply emic.
Yeah. I do. I mean, which isn't to say that we can't learn from them. Like, I think, like in many cases, they help you like hone your intuitions, and like it's important to understand how people's arguments work and things like that. But I do think there's kind of this presumption in most of that literature that there are like moral truths, and through like proper reasoning we can discover those truths. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's a big meta-ethics literature that might question that. But for the most part, what most of moral philosophy does is just kind of presumes that and thinks, and then we would say is doing this kind of like emic game of presenting moral arguments, trying to discover those moral truths using their own reasoning. And I guess we, as well as like presumably most people in the evolutionary literature and psych literature, are skeptical of the claim that there are moral truths.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that begs the question of like, what is this game that philosophers are playing, and why is moral realism, the idea that there are moral truths, so appealing? And what role are these arguments playing? Because they are playing some role. Like they do seem to persuade people. They do seem to have some impact on history. People do pay a lot of attention to moral arguments. And so, given that there aren't moral truths, why is reasoning and argument playing a role? And what exactly is reasoning and argument in this case, given that like the reasoning clearly has to be flawed because it's not discovering truths. There's kind of like it's kind of some pseudo reasoning process. And so it would be nice to know what that process is and how it works. And I guess, we don't have, we'd like to have more insights on it. I guess like the one thing that we've already kind of highlighted is consistency motives. So there's a huge motive to come off as principled and selfless and driven by these principles that are the things that we value in our society and that get norm enforced. And that's going to lead us to kind of try to justify and explain our behaviors in terms of these principles and make us seem like we are consistent with these principles. And so we think that that's a lot of what's going on in these moral arguments is you're trying to present the best case that your own behavior or your coalition's behavior or the behavior you're pushing for is consistent with these set of socially prescribed values. And that brings into play these kind of like pseudo logical arguments about trying to make things seem consistent. And of course, we would then argue it's more about seeming consistent than actual consistency. So you'll get these kind of like logical contortions to force fit things a bit. And things like plausible deniability are then also going to come into play. Like what you really want to avoid making it common knowledge that you're violating this principle. So common knowledge, plausible deniability, consistency, those kind of things are going to matter and are going to contort the way that logic ends up working. And the end goal isn't some kind of abstract Platonic truth, but more like the socially prescribed values or the values that you want other people to think you're actually driven by or want to avoid being sanctioned for violating.
Mm-hmm. But would you call that kind of phenomenon that we see in moral philosophy post hoc rationalization? Because I mean, would you say that basically people already have their prior beliefs and then they work up from them to a philosophical system, let's say?
I mean, I think that happens a lot because I guess you have this idea that there are like strong intuitions and then we want to kind of make it seem like those intuitions are consistent with like some kind of socially desirable set of principles or things like that. You want to develop this kind of that type of argument, and that will end up being post hoc. But I guess some of it isn't necessarily structured that way, even though I do think that is a large part of what happens with moral arguments. But I mean, some of it might just be like, well, let's play the game of like seeing how far this consistency argument can take us, and let's show off how creative we are in making these arguments.
Okay.
And so I think it's not just post hoc justifying your intuitions. There are other games being played as well. But I do think they're all games. I don't think they're like discovering truths. I think it's an interesting set of games and obviously an important set of games. Like not just paid philosophers play this game, and paid philosophers throughout history have had a lot of influence. Maybe nowadays they're somewhat a small set of academia, but historically they've been the leaders of what we consider academic research, and the scientific enterprise have been mostly people sitting in armchairs. It is a very important part of at least Western culture, maybe it's more important in Western culture, but I would venture to guess that in all societies we try to justify our behaviors more or less, and it's important to understand the different games that get played there.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that reason can play a role in influencing what our morals are?
I guess it might get into a longer debate about what we mean by reason.
Sure.
But and maybe that is a discussion worth having. I certainly should think harder about that and read more on it. But I guess if we're defining reason as like these kind of consistency-based arguments that you might see moral philosophers having, or that you might, I don't know, have the suffragettes might have given kind of these arguments based on consistency, and like we mentioned earlier in the discussion, of they would call back to the Declaration of Independence, and say, well, if you want to be consistent with that, you need to give women the vote. So these kind of arguments, reason, if we're just saying reason, there is like some notion of like consistency. Then I think I would kind of call back to that earlier discussion and say, well, that is playing some role. It's not quite the role that moral realists are claiming that it's having. It's not that suffragettes have discovered some like Platonic truth. It's that it's pulling at kind of these notions of plausible deniability, these notions of consistency and principled behavior, that's kind of forcing people's hands, or at least adding some cost benefit to the analysis of well, if we don't allow women to vote, we're going to look inconsistent with these prescribed values. People are going to trust us less, that we're really principled about this notion of equality. And so it kind of, it does affect the cost benefit there. And provided the cost of giving women the vote is sufficiently low relative to this cost of looking inconsistent or hypocritical, it might affect that calculus. And that can have a big impact on history. So that's at least one notion of reason that I think is, and one role that we think it's playing in, moral progress and persuasion, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So one last question about morality, I guess, and then I will go into another question that probably will wrap up our interview. Do you think we can use game theory to nudge people into making better choices and being more moral? I mean, whatever that means in a particular context.
I think both of us would answer yes to that question. I think the naive answer to that question is, what we need to do is just get people to play some game, and then they'll play according to the way that you're hoping that they will play in the game, which is really not at all what we mean when we say yes to that question. But rather, we think the game theory is good at is uncovering features of the psychology that you might then be able to engage or figure out ways to change the environment so that the psychology itself will change, so that folks will behave in ways that are more desirable either for themselves or for others. To give some concrete examples, if we're talking about norm enforcement like we were talking about before, norm enforcement is designed to get us to do these costly behaviors that are good for society. We might want people to do more of those behaviors. Well, what the game theory has managed to do is to tell us these are the environments such that that's going to be possible, and norm enforcement is going to be able to work properly. So you need the norm to be observable, you need the norm to be categorical, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we can do is we can create that environment and make sure that the decision of whether or not to do the costly behavior is being made in that environment. In fact, kind of my day job, or at least kind of half of what I do, is precisely that. So part of the time Mo and I talk about game theory models, and part of the time what I do is team up with companies and governments in order to get people to actually contribute more to public goods of various kinds. I've worked on medication adherence, I've worked on resource conservation, waste management, and so on and so forth, real world public goods. And all I'm doing there is effectively thinking about, this is an environment where norms can do their thing. Let's create that here. It has to have these characteristics. That's the area where we've probably thought most carefully about, and I think not just us, in general, people have thought most carefully about the implications of the game-theoretic analysis for practical real-world guidance. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's probably plenty of other places where this could arise. So for instance, when it comes to thinking about how one should sanction Putin, and thinking about sanctions more broadly, the game theory can give clarity of thought on, does it make sense to sanction even though he's already in Ukraine and it's not going to deter him from doing that? What would the sanctions potentially accomplish? Or it might be the case that if you're thinking about things like media bias and the problems in the United States with Fox News and CNN being so biased and blah, 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 and there being various echo chambers potentially, why do they arise? What's the role of social media in creating them? Is that actually a causal role or not? Should we be worried about that, et cetera? I think you can think about, use the game theory to some extent to get at practical prescriptions in these domains. I don't think we've done our full homework in those domains. I don't think like we could write the practical how-to guide, the game theorists' practical how-to guide of how to create a better society and a better life just yet. I think we've done it when it comes to norm enforcement, at least to some extent. But there's a lot more stuff covered in the book that potentially one could do it for. And there's a lot of interesting work to be done. The places where I would probably start are the two I mentioned, around things like vengeance, apologies, people's intuitive sense of rights and vindictiveness, and how to think about those, and this issue of like false news, biased news, and so on. And are there any practical prescriptions there? But there's probably more. I just happen to have thought about those. Well, anything you would add to?
No, I mean, I guess like we briefly touched on like persuasion and consistency, and you some insights being added there. You know, just in general, I think the game theory helps us kind of understand what people's underlying motives might be, even when they're not consciously aware of them, and look past like the motives they, you know, the things that they claim are driving them. It gives you kind of a toolkit to figure out what the actual underlying motives are, and understanding the actual underlying motives in general ought to be useful in understanding how to push people's levers a little bit more, and how you might want to kind of restructure things or change institutions if you really want to change behavior. Because well, it's going to give you hopefully a much richer understanding of what the kind of ultimate drivers are.
Mm-hmm. So one last question, and I hope to be able to articulate this well enough because it's kind of complicated. So what are beliefs from the point of view of a game theorist in this case? I mean, I'm asking you that because whenever you talk with people about beliefs, you might talk about them with, for example, a philosopher of mind, a social psychologist, even an economist, and sometimes discussions get complicated because people use the term belief in different ways. So, for example, even in economics, we have this distinction. I think it's in economics, I hope I'm not wrong here, but people make this distinction between, for example, stated versus revealed preferences. And I mean, many people assume that we should pay attention not to what people say, but how they behave. And sometimes we also get into this discussion of, okay, so people have this set of beliefs. They say they believe this and that, but what they say they believe, does that really matter? I mean, does that have any influence over their behavior? So, I mean, what do you mean exactly by belief in game theory? And does that get us into any of these kinds of discussions as I am describing or not?
Yeah. Do you mind if I leave?
Yeah, this one's for you.
So I guess we are conflating terms a little bit, like you're pointing out, and so it is worth deconstructing, and I guess it's a longer conversation, and a lot more research should be done on this topic. But I guess initial thoughts. There seems to really be kind of two different types of beliefs, and we should talk about how they might overlap or bleed into each other. But one notion of belief is like, you know, I'm deciding whether to pack an umbrella with me in my backpack when I go to the office today. That's going to really depend on my best guess as to whether it's going to rain. Okay, and that's one notion of belief, which is like, you know, relates to this notion of revealed preferences. It's like, it's the belief that, like, you know, when you're making choices, given your preferences, like, you're going to want to kind of take into account like the optimal, you know, information about the world. And you're internally going to build up a model, you know, about, you know, how weather works, or, you know, what sources are trustworthy, or weather.com seems to be pretty good. And, you know, you're going to use these kind of, your understanding of the world to form a best guess, and use that to inform your decisions when your decisions really depend on the true state of the world. Okay. So that's one notion of belief. Another notion of belief, you know, totally different at least it seems very different from the like whether it's going to rain belief, is like whether this wafer will turn into Jesus when the priest makes a blessing over it. Okay, like why is that a different notion of belief? Well, maybe this will take a little bit more, clarity of thought or language to exactly articulate what's different about it. But I guess one thing that seems different is it's not clear like how that statement maps onto like a real state of the world, or if it even has any like mapping to like any empirical facts. Yeah. It seems to mostly map onto like a set of like values that get enforced in the church that like you're ascribing onto those values. You're saying the priest is powerful. You're saying like God could do mysterious things. You're saying like I'm going to trust what the church tells me more than my own senses. It seems like that's mostly what you're saying when you claim these beliefs. And so and like how it maps onto like what the optimal action is also seems a little bit different. Like it's mostly like it's optimal to like to have this belief if you're a member of the Catholic Church, or if you're in a country where you'll get burnt at the stake for not stating that you adhere to these beliefs. That seems to be the most sense in which it's like practically relevant. Not like, well, I don't know if I bite into it, am I going to get some kind of sickness from eating human flesh? Will I get prions? Like, no, like usually that might be what you'd worry about if this belief is kind of like the weather belief. But like that's totally irrelevant. So this kind of belief seems very different from the other kind of belief. And so when we talk about like beliefs being shaped by incentives and learning processes and game theory models, which of these two types of beliefs are we referencing, and what's the relation between them? Well, I don't know. That seems like a somewhat harder question. I guess what we would say is like, oftentimes incentives, it's very easy to see incentives shaping these second type of beliefs, like the wafer type belief. Like that's clearly you're not getting like much feedback from the universe that helps you build this model about how wafers turn into Jesus. What you're getting is like a lot of pressure from the people who have power over you that says you adhere to these beliefs or you'll get burnt at the stake. And so there it's like pretty straightforward the role that incentives are playing. These beliefs seem very, very susceptible to like peer pressure. Seem very, very susceptible to those kind of processes. What role do the incentives play on the other type of beliefs, the weather stuff? Probably a lot less. And so probably like game-theoretic analysis is going to be more relevant if we want to understand these beliefs that where they're kind of less empirically motivated. But like I don't know, there seems to be some kind of spillover in relation between the two, and like sometimes people seem to like, if you're filled with pressure from your Republican community to like deny climate change, will that bleed over into like your real best guesses about how the world works, and maybe you'll stupidly buy a home in Florida that's going to be submerged in water in a decade or two? I don't know, maybe. Like exactly how much you have spillover between those two types of beliefs, it's not so obvious to me, and I guess maybe there is good research on it, and I'm not aware of it. But if not, there should be. I guess I don't quite know how much bleed over there is between those two, and what might cause it.
There's recent evidence from, for instance, the vaccination. The fact that like Tucker Carlson, for instance, was peddling vaccine disinformation led to many of his viewers not getting vaccinated, and led to higher death rates from COVID. So there is some bleed over, and understanding that is important.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess in our book, like we kind of talk about examples of each, and you're right, we should better distinguish and talk about their relationship. But like I don't know, we give this example also stolen from Henrik about Fiji. So Erez probably remembers these details better than me, but broadly, Henrik, and I think it's co-authored with also Henrik, which is his partner, I guess. Do you remember her first name? So Joe Henrik and
No, I just remember Henrik and Henrik.
Henrik and Henrik, okay. They did this research in Fiji where they kind of looked at people's consumption of women's consumption of shellfish while they're pregnant. And I guess other types of fish too.
Yeah, seafood in general.
Seafood in general. And you know, it turns out that like when you're pregnant, seafood, especially bottom dwellers, are more likely to have like a particular, again, Erez knows these details better.
Bottom dwellers and those that feed on other fish that are higher in the hierarchy are both problematic.
Yeah, and I guess they end up with these, say it again?
Chinguatera is the thing, I think it's called, that is potentially risky for the fetus.
Yeah,
that's what bacteria.
I don't remember. I think it's actually a toxin, not a bacteria, if I remember correctly.
Oh, okay.
And that's why it accumulates in fish that are higher up in the hierarchy and ones that are more omnivorous or whatever, if I remember correctly. Obviously, I don't remember the bio.
Mm-hmm. The relevance of this example is that people in this small-scale society have learned to avoid these particularly problematic species while they're pregnant. With obviously, I mean, we can't remember the biochemistry involved. They certainly, you know, didn't have that knowledge. They just kind of developed sticks and oftentimes beliefs that go along with their heuristics. So they would say things like in the survey that's reported in the appendix to this paper, you know, they interviewed many of the women and asked them, you know, why do you avoid these types of...
the answers tend to be things like, I don't want my kid to have scaly skin, or I don't want him to smell like fish. Things that, like, obviously, they don't really make sense even if you think about it for a second, and yet they have these beliefs, or at least state.
Mm-hmm. And so, you know, here's a case where you have functional behavior without conscious awareness of what the function is, and some belief that is motivating that behavior that turns out to be wrong, but it motivates the right behavior. You know, so what do we call that kind of belief? You know, if you're building a model of the world where when you eat fish while pregnant, your kids come out smelling like fish or having scales, that's a bad model of the world, but it leads to functional behavior. Namely, you know, not eating these fish while pregnant, and so
yeah, it's a good model of the world to me.
Yeah, right. So, so you know, is that best understood of the building up a model the same way I build up a model of the weather when I choose what umbrella to use, and you know, this is just the best they got, or is it kind of more like the priest way, for example, where it's okay, you know, it's got nothing to do with like empirical facts and truth functional. It's just kind of like what's incentivized in some notion of, and like, you know, I don't know, maybe it is the best model of the world, and you know, I guess it's a little bit hard to categorize some of these cases. So let me give you another case that maybe is somewhat, I'm not sure how to categorize.
Let me just interrupt you there for a second, just to make a comment, because I guess that this seafood example is very interesting also in another aspect that I think you haven't mentioned. So, I mean, there's the functionality of it, of course, because women, even if they don't know the exact explanation, the scientific explanation in this case for why they should avoid that type of food when they're pregnant. I mean, it could also probably be the case that even the specific content of the beliefs that are shared socially about why they shouldn't consume that type of food, I can't remember exactly what you said, but something like, okay, so if I consume this type of food, my children will have fish scales or something like that. I don't know. Even that, the specific content of that could not be, or it could be the case that it isn't random or arbitrary. I mean, because I can imagine very easily that telling someone, okay, so if you consume this type of food, your children will develop this and that way that is not socially attractive or attractive to the opposite sex, for example, then that sticks in people's minds, and that would be one of the reasons that kind of belief specifically is successful and not something that perhaps wouldn't have important social consequences for the children, for example.
I think that's true. I guess this brings up like a notion of like psychological attractors, and I guess there's this Paris school that studies those, and I guess I know a lot of it from Manbir Singh. He's got some nice work recently. I don't know if you've interviewed him.
Yeah. In fact, I interviewed him very recently. So
good, yeah. So he's got some nice work that I don't know. He's talking about. I'm gonna botch these details, but hopefully you have him talking about it more fluidly. But well, I forget the name of. There's this crocodile that keeps will eat them or do bad things to them if they do bad things. I don't know. So he has all the details more, but. I guess if I remember correctly, he talks about some of the superstitions around this crocodile involve things that are very psychologically attractive, but obviously nonsense. I don't know if you cheat on your wife, the way that the crocodile punishes you is it's gonna have some correspondence. So if you're building a fire in your kitchen using wood, then your wood on your canoe is gonna break. And so there's some notion of wood that transcends. And I guess you're right that we often have these beliefs that have this structure to them, which to our scientific minds is a very weird structuring, but seems to be psychologically appealing. And I guess Manbir has some good examples of this, but I guess the Paris school in general have a lot more. And I guess so I guess this raises the question, and I guess I'm not an expert on this literature, so maybe we should look into it more, or you should have someone in this school explain it better. But it raises the question of what does this teach us about how beliefs work? Is this just because we're trying to build a model of the world, and the best we can do is assume that wood has these transcendent properties that it happens to if you break wood in your house, it'll break your canoe, and that's just the best we can do, or is that being socially enforced, and it's just using the fact that it's more memorable psychologically as a way to enforce these social norms? Exactly what's going on that's creating these kind of psychological quirks, beliefs. I guess I'm not so sure, and I'm not so sure what it teaches us about beliefs more broadly, but I agree it's an interesting phenomenon.
Also, perhaps another aspect, and I mean, maybe different explanations will work for different beliefs, I guess. But there's also this notion coming a lot from, I guess, social psychology, and also evolutionary psychologists use it a lot, coming from signaling theory, where people think that many beliefs, I'm not sure if everyone says all beliefs, or perhaps some people say all stated beliefs or preferences, at least, that the reason why people say they believe something has nothing or close to nothing to do with the content of the beliefs itself and its epistemic value, but it's just for them to signal to other people their social allegiances or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think social allegiance is clearly playing a big role, but I think that clearly the content is also sometimes going to be quite pertinent. So I don't know, go back to the wafer example. The story of the Eucharist, it might seem like just an arbitrary way to signal whether you're Catholic or Protestant, but I don't think so. I think the content is quite pertinent. When you're saying a priest has the ability to turn a wafer into a god, that's giving the priest a lot of power, and the Catholic Church, as opposed to the Protestant Church, very much relies on the priest being someone who's got a lot of power, and so it doesn't seem arbitrary which of these two churches decided on which interpretation of the Eucharist. Yes, it ends up being a signal of group membership as well, but it seems non-arbitrary what the signal content is. I take Trump's election denial. It's true, a good way to signal that you're a good Republican nowadays is to say the election was rigged, but that's not arbitrary. That happens to also make Trump seem like less of a loser. It also happens to help justify the shenanigans to restrict the vote and to overturn the next election. So, it seems I'm not denying that there's a group signaling component, but it does seem like the content is also playing, an important role, and the content wasn't selected at random.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, would you like to comment anything else on this topic of belief, or
Well,
perhaps we could wrap up the interview here and continue on in the second one later on in the year or something like that?
I'm more than happy to continue on with another one later, and hopefully Erez would be happy to join too.
Yeah, of course.
I did have one or two more points I wanted to mention about beliefs. If people want to go, they can. But maybe one thing to say on the cognitive attractor story. I don't know if that's the right word for it, or if there's another word for this particular phenomenon that you brought up. Is it you know, the wood breaking example or whatever? It raises an important question, which an important distinction, I think, which is between explaining the content of beliefs versus in a way that, like, you know, there might be an interesting psychological story for why the content of beliefs have this structure, and that may or may not have an impact on actual behavior. And I think there's an important distinction between the content of beliefs that are kind of like payoff or behaviorally irrelevant, and the stuff that like really matters for people's behavior, and that we actually like have an incentive to like push people to believe, or that and the game theory stories that we tell and the incentive stories that we tell are really going to be relevant when the content matters, at least to somebody. And so we think there could be all sorts of these other like cognitive stories, but like to us, like there's a separate question of is that actually materially relevant? If not, it could still be interesting, but like we'll have less to say about it. But there are going to be many cases that are materially relevant that I think we'll have more to say about, like, you know, Trump's election denial, like climate denial, like the Eucharist. Like in those cases, we think incentives are going to have a lot of bite in explaining what's going on, and so will game theory. And I guess we hadn't talked about that much, but we have you know, 2 book chapters on how people spin and how rhetoric works and motivated reasoning work, and that's a huge subset of like what we think of as beliefs that are really not well explained, we think, by these like cognitive stories, and much better explained by the incentives for persuading other people, and the incentives for influencing other people's beliefs. And anyhow, I thought that was maybe an important distinction to add.
Mo, can I ask, maybe you referenced the Paris School and you referenced Monver's work. Do you have offhand, you know, references for this? If folks do want to look at the other kind of work, not the incentive stuff?
I should. I'm guessing that Ricardo knows.
Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm curious myself. And so
better. I know that there's this really classic work on minimally counterintuitive gods. I'm forgetting the exact reference.
Minimally counterintuitive ideas, right?
Oh, I see.
That's one of the supposed mechanisms that people in the cognitive science of religion use to explain why certain specific beliefs in different religions are sticky. Let's say.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And I guess like I don't know. I think that's actually a good example where like I think that might explain. So the idea is that gods often have like, you know, they're pretty close to human, but with like some slight difference. Like they can go through walls, or they can see you even when they're not there, or you know. But otherwise, they're human-like, and that's like fairly common for gods. And I think that kind of illustrates like you could explain some of the contents of our belief system with this like cognitive story about how memory works, or how, you know, what kinds of things are going to be sticky. But like I want to contrast that with like the big God story, which says, okay, but what kind of gods are going to culturally evolve because of the material implications they have, like on motivating pro-social behavior. Yeah. And like that's another story that will also help us understand other aspects of our belief system. Namely, gods are going to be moralizing, and they're going to, you know, do things like police women's sexuality and stuff like that. Okay, so like that's a different aspect of people's religious beliefs that's going to be explained differently, but that's going to be much more like the minimal counterintuitive stuff will explain some of the contents, but not really have much in terms of like material behavioral ramifications. At least I don't think. I think it's mostly like, oh, it's an interesting cognitive story that helps us understand some of the emic details. but it's not, almost by definition, isn't going to have much behavioral ramifications. Because it's kind of like payoff irrelevant stuff, like, whether the gods look like this or look like that, it's kind of irrelevant. Like, it might be interesting, but it's not going to be, whereas, like, if you want to explain pro-social behavior, well, you need a story like the big God story. Like the minimal counterintuitive, I think, is going to explain less about, like, how gods help us enforce norms.
I think that's a point that recently some cognitive scientists of religion have been making, that minimally counterintuitive ideas explain much less about why people adopt certain religious beliefs than was previously thought. So,
yeah, my sense is that it'll often explain, things that are details that are kind of payoff irrelevant. So, like, exactly, if you're going to need a god that, like, moralizes stuff and enforces behavior, what do you make that god look like?
Is he a crocodile or not? Is he a human or not?
Exactly. If you need to punish people for cheating on their wives, how do you describe the punishment? Okay, the boat's going to break. It's kind of, that part of how you describe it is somewhat irrelevant. You might as well take something sticky. But what's important is that the gods are helping you kind of motivate people to act according to the norms and so on.
Yeah. So, anything else, or should we go?
No, I guess that's good. Maybe one other loose end I wanted to tie up, which maybe was clear earlier, was Erez kind of mentioned these distinctions: emic-etic, proximate, ultimate, primary, secondary. I just kind of wanted to really highlight that when we use game theory in the book, and this is different from how most economists, or especially behavioral economists, will think about game theory. We're really applying it, and I just wanted to highlight this, make this very explicit. We're applying it at the level of primary rewards. So we're thinking about the incentives, the payoffs in the model as the primary rewards, not the secondary rewards. And we're using it to give etic explanations and ultimate functional explanations. So that's, I just kind of wanted to tie together those loose ends, and that's how we're using game theory.
Okay.
The only thing I wanted to add.
Okay, so the book is again Hidden Games, The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview, and also some links to your work. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and as I said, I hope to have you on again later in the year to continue on the conversation.
No, always happy to.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Always enjoy our conversations.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Van Nagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.